Achtung. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and with James Holland, of course. Jim, who are we talking to today? We've got a guest, and I expect at some point my head might hurt talking about this subject because it's that part of sort of, I don't know, sociological thinking and stuff.
Economics, Al. Economics.
Yeah, exactly. That.
Economics.
I was trying to sidle up to it without.
I'm just going to be brazen and blunt. Yeah, no, I'm as you know. I mean, you know, we talked about this a number of times, and you mentioned it the other day. We don't just need historians. We need people who can give us different perspectives on the war, which is why, of course, we've come to the economic guru that is Duncan Weldon. You know, political advisor, journalist, Newsnight's economic and business editor back in the day, and an all-round economist.
Well, an author of 200 years of muddling through the surprising story of Britain's economy from boom to bust and back. So I'm expecting some muddling through, Duncan, in the history of the Second World War.
But yeah, the economy in the war. That's what we want to talk about.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Thanks for that introduction. If you haven't put all of the listeners off already, we'll try and get them back on board.
Oh, and you're at Duncan Weldon on Twitter, and I like seeing your tweets because you I mean, obviously you didn't need a rocket scientist to work out that Liz Truss's ideas weren't exactly top of the pile of good sense, but you do make very good sense of stuff that I don't really understand, so I'm very grateful to you.
Much appreciated.
So, Duncan, what is the story of the Second World economics in the Second World War? Because obviously it's foreshadowed by 20 years of sort of turmoil and post First World War fallout. So what happens in the economy during the war?
Yeah, I mean, I think World War One and World War Two, you've got to look at them not just through that sort of military lens, but through the economic lens as well. They're the first sort of 20th century proper, total war. This isn't just two national armies fighting each other. This is entire nations under arms, people, society, economies being mobilised, and everything else going out of the window, and just raising the resources to fight the war being crucial. And I think in both of those wars, economic factors played, I think, ultimately a decisive role in both. In both cases, it was those sort of the countries that had the bigger industrial output that could mobilise more resources, which ultimately sort of won that long wrestling match, which both wars really came down to in the end.
Yeah.
Well, Phillips, Payson, O'Brien would agree with you, and frankly, so do I. We've been looking at this because everyone always says that the war was won on the Eastern Front, and that was where the most blood was spilled and all the rest of it. If you look at it from a purely economic point of view, it was absolutely won on the Western Front, not the Eastern. So it's that is interesting. The other thing I'm kind of really interested in is these patterns that you get of human behaviour, which of course is why history is so worthwhile studying. And if you look at obviously the Wall Street crash in 1929, and you look at the fallout of that, 10 years later you've got a world war. And if you think about sort of 2008, and here we are, a little over a decade later, and we've got sort of populist governments, and you've got war in Ukraine, and the world is a very different place than it was in 2008. I mean, do you think those patterns are relevant?
Well, that's a cheery thought, isn't it? I think those patterns. Yeah, I think those patterns are relevant. I think generally, stepping back just from the war. I think one thing that came across when I was looking at the last 200 odd years of British economic history is when you get periods when the economy is, to use a technical term, in the toilet, then politics becomes much more fractious, much more divisive, and so that interwar period, sort of the 1920s and the 1930s, period of sort of sluggish growth, really high unemployment, all of those economic shocks, you get some really, really very nasty politics in some parts of the world. And I think that does sort of add towards that sort of turn to authoritarian governments, this sort of fighting for resources, which, if you look at the war in Asia, there's an awful lot of sort of economic underpinnings of, Japan is it is trying to capture resources. It's trying to capture bauxite and oil resources. All of this, it's a very explicitly sort of economically driven form of sort of imperialism in the war in Asia.
Well, yes, and Japan's big problem is also it just can't get. It doesn't have many natural resources itself, and it's a really mountainous country. So it's all the urban areas are sort of around the coast, aren't they? And there's not a lot of farmland, and suddenly you've got this burgeoning population. You've got this growing urban population. What do you do? Well, what they're doing in the 1920s and 30s is getting a lot of it from elsewhere. Buying it from the United States and so on.
Yeah.
But the reason they're going to China is not just because they fancy capturing China for kicks. I mean, they're doing it because they want to kind of plunder its resources, don't they?
Oh, completely. And but what I think was interesting is if you sort of step back and you look at Britain in both wars.
Yes.
Britain, another island nation, all of this. But the interesting thing about Britain is, the way Britain fights both world wars is, in stark contrast to how Japan in the Second World War or Germany in either war goes about thinking about. Britain fights both wars as sort of as part of a global, a very globalist approach to how the British economy is run. Britain is a country which has been an importer of food since the 1840s. And in the First World War and the Second World War, it continues to import food. It imports meat from Latin America. It imports it imports all of these different materials. And Britain, if you look at sort of the German approach in both wars or the Japanese approach in the Second World War, they're sort of striving for autarky, for national self-sufficiency. And they think their country's war efforts will be stronger if they control all of these resources. Britain fights both wars in a very different way. It continues to import an awful lot of goods. And actually, what I think is really interesting is, British policymakers explicitly see this as a strength, it means that Britain is importing its food, and as long as you can keep the sea lanes open and continue to import that food, that's an advantage because it means you don't have to have a huge chunk of your population working in the fields. You can put them into munitions factories or into uniform directly.
The First World War. Am I right in thinking the British government essentially tried to act like it's not happening economically? That there's essentially a laissez-faire attitude to the conflict, and then there's an ammunition crisis in 1915, and they've run out of all sorts of stuff, and they realise that this isn't working, and there's inflation and all this sort of stuff. The Second World War, I mean, I think part of the way the story of the Second World War is told is that everyone knows it's coming. It's going to happen. It's not, because the First World War is of course portrayed, although recent historians like Christopher Clark have tried to argue differently, that the First World War is coming a mile off, whereas, the traditional story is that it comes out, it's a bolt out the blue, and the Second World War, in contrast, is a thing that everyone's getting ready for, preparing for. I mean, we've talked on this podcast that Chamberlain is actually rearming like mad. He's got this Fortress Britain idea. He's going to rearm and try and deter the Germans. It doesn't work, of course. When the Second World War comes, the British government's attitude is far more, right, here we go again. This is what we learned last time. This is what we're going to do. Is that a reasonable characterisation?
I think that's completely fair. I think, the great advantage that sort of the government, policymakers, strategists, etc. have in the Second World War is they've got the experience of the First World War. And in 1914, when Britain goes to war, there is this attempt at first to sort of run the economy as business as usual. And I think there's sort of an unresolved question as to what kind of war Britain is going to fight in 1914, and I think a lot of the British leadership think they're going to fight something that looks like the Napoleonic Wars, in that Britain's going to be this offshore financer and industrial powerhouse behind the Allies, fight a naval war, provide money, provide munitions, etc., and not get drawn into a major land war in Europe that obviously goes out of the window very quickly. And it's this sort of slow process for 1915, 1916, of it sort of gradually dawning on the government how large an undertaking they've gotten themselves into, and just taking previously unimagined controls over industry, over transport, all of that sort of, building this big state apparatus which Britain's never seen before to manage national output. And when we get to the Second World War, everyone knows what it's going to be like. Those lessons are applied. Those sort of wartime controls and planning are put in place much quicker. And it's a much better managed war economically by Britain.
Yeah.
And we get much more output straight away. And it's a much better financed war as well. Like, in the First World War, this is one of the sort of business as usual things. It sounds quite striking now, but suddenly the government is going to be spending an awful lot of money over 4 years. And in the First World War, at first, the government tries to go about financing that like it's previously financed stuff. It just issues bonds to investors. It gives them quite a high interest rate to make sure there's enough demand. And then at the end of the war, you've got this government just left sort of, carrying this enormous and very, very, very expensive debt, which is one of the things really crippling the British economy in the 1920s. Whereas when you get to the Second World War, there's no attempt at business as usual. The city is basically told, you are going to buy these bonds, this is your patriotic duty, and you're going to buy them at a really low interest rate too. It's just a much better financed war.
What does that then... What freedom of movement does that give the British government then, in contrast to the First World War? What sort of economic space does it create for itself? Because after all, the Second World War, the British government going to thinking, right, well, we're going to fight a naval war. We're probably going to stall the Germans on the French frontier. We're going to kind of probably fight something fairly similar to last time round.
We're going to sort of get lots of bombers over to Germany if that doesn't work, and we're going to sort of bludgeon them.
Extend the blockade through bombing, and essentially fight the Second World War again, but now we know what we're doing,
and also largely from the UK.
Yeah,
from naval bases and airfields. That's the idea.
Yeah. So what economic space does this new approach by the British government because after all, then the war doesn't go according to plan, because it's all very well what they do in 39, early 40, putting this together, but then the arse falls out of everything. To use a technical term, in the strategic earthquake, as we call it on this podcast, where France falls, Britain's out of Europe. What does this new economic plan then help in that situation, or is it actually turn out to be inadequate?
I mean, it has to, like everything, it has to be reassessed after, let's call it a strategic earthquake, in sort of, May, June 1940. I mean, it's interesting when you look at, Britain is rearming like mad by the late 1930s. I'm completely right on that. But it's interesting how sort of politicians talk about that. You get explicit talk of the strength of Britain's economy as sort of the fourth arm of so you've got the Air Force, you've got the Navy, you've got the Army, and the strength of the economy is the fourth arm of defence. Is how
gosh, isn't that interesting?
Certainly that's what Treasury officials like to call it, but it seems to sort of penetrate into the Cabinet Office as well. And this sort of belief that what the Treasury was trying to do in the late 1930s was this balancing act, in that sort of the lesson of the First World War as Treasury officials, and the Treasury, absolutely central department in how British government is run, particularly when you've got a Prime Minister like Neville Chamberlain, a former Chancellor surrounded by Treasury officials. Sort of the thinking is World War II is going to look something like the Great War did. It's going to be long, it's going to be drawn out, and in the end, economic strength is going to be decisive. The country that can mobilise the most resources, sustain its war.
And that's pretty accurate, isn't it?
Yeah,
let's face it.
I think it's completely accurate. So, what Britain wants to do is... so Britain is fairly confident it can win a long war against Germany. Its economy is just a much stronger economy. Britain is a much richer country than Germany.
So, and it has shipping, doesn't it? It has lots and lots of merchant shipping. It has access to the world's oceans, has access to the world's markets and resources in a way that Germany just doesn't at all.
Yeah, exactly. So what you've got to ensure is you've got to rearm enough that you're not going to lose a war very quickly, but not rearm so quickly that you damage your economy doing it. And that's sort of the balancing act, I think, the Treasury is explicitly thinking about. And it's one they get just about right. It survives that strategic earthquake. And then you have to, very quickly you get into... Lend-Lease and all of this sort of more. America is the United States is economically engaged in the war much earlier than December 1941.
Yeah. Of course, but how much is? Huge play is made of the fact that Britain has run out of money by March 1941, and I always sort of get the impression people who say that, it's by the letter true, but not really true, because running out of cash doesn't really mean, but because you're this huge, great trading nation with this huge merchant fleet and with this huge empire and huge extra imperial assets as well, your purchasing power is absolutely enormous compared to literally just about everybody. So running out of cash isn't quite the kind of sort of the terrible kind of voodoo that it seems on paper.
Yeah.
Is that right, or is that wrong?
I think that is right. I think that there's a caveat to that, but it's generally right. And I think, that this is another difference in how how people approach the Second World War and the economy to the First World War. In the First World War, you've still got sort of officials walking around Whitehall sort of, fretting, how are we going to pay for this? And in the Second World War, they realise the constraint isn't money. The constraint is sort of the real ability of the economy to produce output. And you'll sort of, you'll figure out the money side of it later. The most important thing is to produce what you need to produce. The caveat...
Okay, and how do you get round that? How do you square that one?
Yeah, so,
for the layman who doesn't understand economics.
Yeah, so in the... so they just put in the Second World War, they just, order the resources they need, and then they tell the city... you're going to finance it. Use a bit of moral suasion at first, and if that doesn't work, then you put restrictions. So, you say, amazingly, this didn't happen straight away in the First World War. In the Second World War, they say, okay, nobody is going to be selling shares to raise money or, raising a commercial bond to finance whatever they want to do. All available savings are effectively being pushed into the war effort. Business as usual stops in the city. The banks, the insurance companies, whatever, their resources are put to work. The caveat to all of this, where money does matter, is where you're buying stuff from overseas. And I think in both wars, Britain eventually faces basically a dollar crunch, in that you need dollars to be able to purchase stuff in the United States. And, obviously there's a messy history to this, that, most countries effectively default on their debts to the United States from the First World War. And so anything you want to buy in America has to be bought on what's rather wonderfully called a cash and carry basis, that you can't borrow in dollars to fund your war production. So you've got to be handing over the dollars to purchase whatever you're purchasing in the US. And, by sort of 1940 getting into 1941, Britain is really running short on dollar assets. We've literally requisitioned everyone's dollar-based shares in the country and sold those. Yeah. So it's like, we're trying to find dollars, and Lend-Lease is a way around that. America basically agrees to, essentially supply Britain with an awful lot of its needs from the United States, and we will think about payment later.
So how does America do it? Because America's obviously gone through the Great Depression. It's on a bit of an upturn by 1939, but it's still not kind of out of the woods. And yet suddenly in 1940, Roosevelt can push 200 billion, was it 50 billion for dollars through Congress for war production, and get all the big manufacturers, particularly the car manufacturers, on board, and steel producers and all the rest of it. But how do you generate? I sort of understand the basics of it, but I've never really understood how you're able to do that, just by sort of the government saying, okay, we want to now build, 300,000 aircraft and 100,000 tanks. It's all very well saying that, but how do you actually finance that? How do you make that work? And I know what they do is they harness big business, and they harness commercial production alongside military production until they're in full steam ahead military production. But how does that work exactly?
Yes, I think the advantage America has going into the war, it's not really an advantage, but the silver lining America has to a rather big cloud is, the economy has had a really difficult 1930s. And in economic terms, you have a lot of spare capacity in that economy.
So there's loads of slack in the American industrial
loads of slack, because you've still got very high unemployment. You've still an economy which hasn't really fully recovered from the crash in 29, then the Great Recession, Depression following it. So you've got that slack. And because you've got that slack, if someone steps up there and injects a load of demand into the economy, in this case, the US government ordering aircraft, ordering tanks, allied nations ordering goods from the United States, that slack can just, move in and boost production. The potential is there. And, and America's in this really weird position in sort of the early 1940s of, yeah, I mean, the American economy really, really booms during the war. It's not just supplying, the American armed forces, it's supplying Britain, it's supplying other allied nations, just a huge amount of sort of demand going into that economy.
I mean, it's almost a sort of second industrial revolution for the Americans, isn't it? In terms of the way that its manufacturing is completely electrified. And obviously the bow wave of that is in the 50s. They create a consumer economy to meet their industrial capacity. That they've sort of retooled themselves as a industrially, haven't they? Effectively. How do you? I suppose the slack in the American economy means you can do that without massive wage inflation, all that sort of stuff. Because certainly in 1940, Britain's got wage inflation going on, hasn't it? Because people are joining the army, reserved occupations become more important. So you have this peculiar thing where people are going off to the army, and actually on the home front, kind of before the Blitz starts, people are kind of living quite well on the home front, aren't they? Because their wages have gone up. There's a whole chunk of people being removed from the consumer chain. And so if you're buying consumer goods in 1940 and you've got a reserved occupation, you're living a good life, aren't you?
Yeah, completely. And then, another thing where the Second World War, where lessons have been learned from the first, is in, realising that doing a deal with Britain's trade unions early is a very good idea. You end up with Ernie Bevan at the Ministry of Labour. You bring in the leader of the Transport and General Workers Union, the biggest union. And, his job is to try and keep everyone sweet. The First World War, we did see quite widespread strikes at various times. Disputes over this. The Second World War, the deal is done with Labour very quickly. Particularly once you've gone to the national government, once Labour have entered, the political party Labour have entered the cabinet. It's much easier to do this sort of deal. The other aspect of that is, British policymakers are worried about what inflation might do in the war, not because they don't just like inflation, because the impact it will have on the war effort. So one of the reasons that taxes on incomes are put up quite sharply at the start of the war is not just to raise money, because in the end you're putting up taxes by a bit, but you're still going to be borrowing an absolute shed load of money. It's not you're not going to pay for this war through tax. The argument for putting up taxes really is to try and take a bit of the heat out of consumer spending, and it's when we see the invention of something most of us are now familiar with. Pay-as-you-earn taxation is invented in the Second World War to bring in tax revenues quicker. Take a bit of income out of households to slow down consumer spending faster. And, the great advantage from the Treasury's point of view of pay-as-you-earn taxation is it allows you to level income tax on people with a lower income who aren't, used to building up a large pot of money to pay the following year.
And you get the money now as well. You're not getting it the following year. So that helps your receipts basically, doesn't it? At the Treasury. Whose innovation is that? Is that some wonk in the Treasury?
Yes, we can thank the Napoleonic Wars for income tax and the Second World War for pay-as-you-earn income taxes.
It's interesting though because it is a characteristic of wars, certainly in this country, that they result in the extension of the state, don't they? Inevitably, and then I suppose the absolute signature of this is the Beverage Report, which is where economics, social policy, and the war all sort of, like a magician's links suddenly a magician's rings, suddenly connected. Where's Beveridge's thinking within this economic picture? Because after all, You say that the war's being much better managed economically to start with, but there's got at some point it's going to end. At some point you're going to have to pay. You're going to have to find the money for all this stuff you're buying that you're going to solve the problem later. Does Beveridge fit into that picture, or is he purely concerned domestically, economically, with what's going to happen, or is he also part of this kind of how you exit the war, how you re-gear your industry, how you deal with a load of men coming back into the workforce and all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, again, I think what's sort of sitting on everyone's shoulders here is the end of the First World War, when, there was all of this talk of, a land fit for heroes and homes for heroes.
And then it wasn't.
And then it wasn't, no. Then you get this sort of, Britain, if anyone ever says roaring 1920s when they're talking about Britain's economy, just tell them they're wrong. America had a roaring 20s. Britain had an incredibly miserable 1920s of high unemployment, the general strike, really sluggish growth. This was all sort of the impact of the war. The war had left Britain with a load of debts for the first time. Britain transformed from being this international creditor to this international debtor. Its industry was twisted out of shape. It had lost access to some important export markets, all of that. Miserable 1920s. And I think Beveridge is, part of a push to make sure that doesn't happen again. That, Britain is fighting its second economic total war in 30-odd years, and this one, the aftermath, is going to be managed better. And it's quite interesting when you look at Beveridge that it sort of assumes that we're now going to be in a world of full employment. That that policymakers have learned how to manage the economy to keep demand high, to keep unemployment low, and that the Beverage Report is about filling in the gaps around this this full employment society where support is needed, which doesn't turn out to be the case in the long run. But I think it's a very conscious learning the lessons of what happened last time and making sure it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, and what is the state of, you were saying how bad the state of the British economy is in the 1920s, but I mean, that's before the Wall Street crash. Then you have the crash. Then you got the Depression. I mean, things aren't great in the 1930s either, are they? I mean, there's loads of industries which are in a really bad way. I mean, agriculture's absolutely fallen through the floor. All these structures and industries which are going to be so vital for the Second World War effort are in a really bad state, and yet you still have this enormous global reach, which is presumably it's kind of one of its saving factors. Yeah,
so you get the British economy starts to recover in the sort of mid-30s. Interest rates are cut to incredibly low levels. You get a house building boom, which puts more people into work, and you get the growth of sort of new, more modern light industries, particularly in the south of England. But it's this very different regional picture in the 30s in Britain. So the northeast, bits of the northwest, central belt in Scotland, South Wales, bits of the Midlands even, in a really dire state. But then, booming new towns, booming sort of newer towns, not new towns, in the south, and there is a recovery in place, which is then helped towards the end of the 30s by the first steps towards rearmament. Sort of fighter production goes up as you see the shadow factories go into operation.
We're going to take a very short break now. We'll be back in a second. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, James Holland, and we are talking to Duncan Weldon, who's expanding our minds with the world of economics. At the start of the war, the pound's fixed the dollar, isn't it? That there's a decision that the pound will be fixed, that Britain will carry on trading and will sort out where the money's going to come from in the end. Then halfway through the war, there's trying to create the land fit for heroes in the form of the Beverage Report. But then the war ends. What happens next to the British economy? Because after all, I mean, you get a Labour government as well who are coming in to enact Beveridge. You're going to have to spend some money nationalising stuff. They're going to withdraw from empire pretty quickly. It is pretty certain, because certainly one of the things that's definitely happened over the course of the war is the British public are no longer care for the British Empire. They're not interested in it anymore. They don't see the benefit of the thing. So what happens next? May the 8th, or do things fall off a cliff, or does that happen in August, or what happens?
So what takes the British government by surprise is how quickly the US ends Lend-Lease straight after the war. And there's been sort of this working assumption it would be gradually phased out, and instead you get this sort of cliff edge. And Churchill, by then in opposition, is actively helpful to the government, lobbying the Americans on this. He calls it a financial Dunkirk, what the Americans have done, sort of the scale of ending Lend-Lease. So you get this very difficult, sort of immediately after the war, in Britain and across Europe, you've got a really difficult first 2 or 3 years, which is all really a question of, the only industry up there able to, satisfy consumer desires is across the Atlantic in North America. Much of industry on the continent has been devastated by the war. Britain's industry has sort of been twisted into a very, war-facing direction. And there's this huge shortage of dollars. Countries need to find a source of dollars so they can buy this stuff from the United States. And, Britain is embarking on the first stages of dismantling the empire of decolonisation. We're heading towards Indian independence. But it is really interesting how, the Attlee government, obviously a left-wing Labour government, is critically aware it needs these dollars. If you look at how Britain goes about reimposing rule in areas that had been conquered by the Japanese, that's partially a dollar thing. So, what you want Malaysian rubber plantations up and running as quickly as you can, because you earn dollars by selling rubber from Malaysia. So it's very much,
wow.
The aftermath of where can we get dollars, do that. What sort of, changes the situation is when you get the Marshall Plan. A few years after the war, when the United States basically steps up with this, what's called the European Recovery Plan, named after George Marshall, former general, now Secretary of State, which is essentially going to provide an awful lot of dollars to European countries that will accept it, to help them rebuild their economies, and it's dollars that they need, and that really changes.
And why is the US doing that? Because it thinks that a global market, a globally flourishing Western market, is helpful for America.
Yeah, I think it's two things. I think
it's not pure altruism.
No,
is
it's
it?
not that. It's not that. It's not pure altruism. I think a flourishing Western European economy is good for America, and then of course you've got the sort of onset of the Cold War as well. In that the countries which take the Marshall Aid in the end turn out to be those in the Western sphere, and the Soviet Union doesn't let Eastern Europe take the money, although it is initially offered to them as well. And so it's partially it's good for America to have a strong booming a stronger European economy, and it's partially that America needs to make sure its allies are in a position to potentially fight another total war against the Soviet Union.
And a lot of people always say, well, of course, we only just finished paying Lend-Lease in 2008 or whatever, 2007 or when it was, when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister. And of course, that's absolutely nonsense. We never paid for Lend-Lease at all. But it was post-war loans, wasn't it?
Yes, post-war loans. We have to get some. We negotiate some post-war loans. We send Keynes over to Washington. By now, Lord Keynes, he's Treasury Minister again,
yes.
He negotiates the post-war loan, which is paid back. I mean, the other thing is, we tend to talk a lot about Lend-Lease and the post-war dollar loans. Another big source of financing for Britain's war effort came from countries called the sterling area. So in the 1930s, lots of dollar wasn't the dominant currency it is today. Lots of countries conducted their trade in sterling, mainly the components of the British Empire, except Canada, which worked in a dollar system. But most of the empire was using sterling, pound, and so were some other countries not in the empire. So Argentina was on the sterling standard because it did a lot of trade with Britain that made sense. And what happened during the war was something rather techie. I will do my best to make as less techie as we can. The sterling balances. And what the sterling balances was countries agreed to continue selling Britain the stuff it usually imported, but they agreed to leave that money in London. So Britain continued to buy meat from Argentina, and it paid Argentina for that meat, but the money was left in London. So effectively, it was like a long-term loan from these countries to Britain, which was as big a story as Lend-Lease was. Indian, Egyptian, Argentinian, all of these other countries financing of Britain's war effort.
Well, that's amazing, because that's new to me. I don't know about you, Al. I hadn't heard about that. And
I knew about the sterling area, but I didn't know that was the way the sterling area was being.
Yeah, no, that's what I meant. I mean, I didn't realise about the Argentines.
Yeah.
And,
I knew about Argentina. I mean, part of what's also happening in the war is the Americans are seeking to break sterling dominance, aren't they? And it's an opportunity for them to do exactly that, and that's exactly what they do, isn't it? I mean, it's you know, I think it's always interesting when people talk about the Marshall Plan in terms of altruism. Well, maybe. I mean, I always think that's kind of stretching it, really, because the war is very much an opportunity for the Americans to shatter this sterling dominance in world trade, isn't it?
Yeah, and they insist.
They grab it with both hands.
Yeah, they insist when we get the PostWar loans that we will make sterling convertible, not have like a fixed price, which causes all sorts of problems. Britain gets this awful winter in sort of 47, 48, when we've shortage of dollars, meaning we're struggling to import certain things. It's all very messy. I mean, one upside of all of it.
Bad winter as well.
Yeah, bad winter. One good upside of sort of the dollar crunch is, the birth of modern British cinema. In that, we're trying to limit imports of. We're trying to conserve our precious dollars. So the government is very keen to import as few Hollywood films as possible. So you get all of your Ealing comedies and all of this, because you can make those and pay for them in sterling.
Right. Amazing.
I had no idea.
The thing is the Attlee government is famous for the welfare state, but it is a warfare state still, isn't it? Essentially, and is still skewed to war production. Because after we see the birth of the jet age during that time, and
250,000 people in Britain working in the aviation industry in 1946.
Wow,
that's incredible. And we've on this podcast we've talked about the development of the jet engine before, and a story that's painted of that is this great missed opportunity. It was in fact the production of the piston engine is working perfectly well within the parameters you need for fighting the war and ending it by 1945. But the jet engine is what you need for 46, 47, 48, and that's the way it's geared. And aviation is geared for this exit, which relies on the continuation of a warfare state under the Attlee government. And and then of course the Attlee government gets involved in the Korean War, because it's a warfare state, arguably.
Well, yes, and if you think about the Rolls-Royce Avon, for example, which is the first sort of turbojet engine, it's I think that's designed and first built in 1944, and it goes into production in 1946.
Yeah, I mean, defence spending is much higher than health and education spending, throughout the 1940s. Once the war is finished, and obviously conscription doesn't end either; it transitions into national service. I think a warfare state as well as a welfare state is a really fair description of what is, Major Attlee's government after all, I suppose.
Yeah,
and let's not forget it. It's not like there isn't any war.
Exactly.
I mean, there's troubles. There's troubles in the Middle East. There's Malaya. There's Korea. There's Suez. I mean, it doesn't stop.
And there's the burgeoning question of deterrence around an atomic weapon, which, of course, the British government needs to get its hands on.
I think we get atomic in 1948, don't we?
Well, and there's the business of Attlee secretly spending £1 million on it, and Churchill making a big fuss when he finds out, isn't there? That later on, how dare you spend this money without running it past Parliament? I mean, the thing is if you view the 40s as a block rather than trying to sort of find the moment when the war ends and what happens next, there's more of a continuum to the entire thing, isn't there? And in fact, that's actually probably a more fruitful way of looking at what happens economically in the UK in the 40s, because at the same time as you've got the economy, obviously the state in relation to GDP, demands grow, taxation goes up, debt goes up, but the British Empire contracts at the same time. The sterling area is broken on the wheel of the dollar. I mean, the sort of that Britain continues to try and spend money on as a global player in 1950. It's quite extraordinary, really, isn't it? And not particularly realistic.
Yeah, I think it takes Britain a long time to adjust to its sort of change standing in the global economy. And the big change is the First World War. Going into Britain in 1912, 1913, just before the First World War, is this utterly extraordinary economy. If you compare it to now, Britain in sort of 1911, Britain about 1910, just before the First World War, is the single largest manufacturing power in the world. It's the largest exporter of energy in the world, and it's the centre of global finance. So today, it's like combining the place of China, Saudi Arabia, and New York in one country. Britain is just this extraordinarily successful, important economy in just for the First World War. And the First World War really changes that. Britain becomes a debtor. It loses loads of export markets. It's suddenly got this very high debt.
And that's just the cost of the First World War.
Just the First World War was extraordinary cost. And and the world economy changes. Before the First World War, we're in sort of an age of we're in effectively an age of globalization, of rising international trade, of cross-border lending, of lots of mobility of people, of ideas, of goods, of capital. And then in the 1920s and 30s, you're into this sort of more autarkic, protectionist world of trade barriers going up. There being less trade, there being less cross-border lending, etc. And Britain's economic model struggles in that world. And I think after the Second World War, the real blows come in the First World War, but the transition back to something approaching peacetime is managed much better. The debts have been managed much better during the war, so you don't have this crippling interest expense that you had in the 1920s. But it's still, despite all of that, it takes sort of British policymakers a good 20 years to, but depending whether you mark it as Suez or whether you mark it as the decision to pull out of east of Suez military commitments in the late 60s, it takes Britain, a good 10, 15 years to sort of, Britain is still a very important economy at this point, but it is not the major world power it was at the start of the 20th century.
Yeah, I mean, Britain's position at as you say, before the First World War it is amazing. It's absolutely extraordinary, but it's also interesting. It's only 4 years to shatter that completely, and a lot of the in between. Do you think that some of the sort of protectionism and retrenchment in between the wars is a sort of a reaction to the idea we had this global world and look where it got us, and so we need to protect us because there tends to be a pendulum that swings, doesn't it, from globalization then back to protectionism, and the pendulum swings at its own kind of rate. You could argue we're going through a protectionist phase now after a long period of globalization, post Cold War. Is that what's happening in between in the 20s, or is it that when things go wrong, you retrench, you head towards autarky?
Yeah, so Britain,
just as James said at the start of this, 2008, 2009, and is it a product of the idea of the failure of global trade?
Yeah, so sort of there's definitely a push in the 1930s in Britain to sort of turn more towards the empire and away from open global markets. Britain's been this great free trading country since the 1840s, and then in the early 1930s, Britain starts putting up tariffs, imperial preference, it's called, favouring trade of the empire, and you get, the empire marketing board encouraging people to buy empire butter rather than, Danish and Dutch butter, etc. The English breakfast becomes a bit more imperial. The bacon stops coming from Denmark, and the butter stops coming from the Netherlands. So yeah, you do get this more inward turn in the 30s, which you see again after the Second World War. Britain is becomes a bit more reliant on trade with colonies and former colonies in the 50s.
And Duncan, I mean, there was a sort of new trend in the 1960s to kind of sort of rubbish the British war effort in its entirety. I'm thinking it's sort of A.J.B. Taylor and the likes. And particularly damn the war economy. I mean, I've got a book somewhere up in my shelf which sort of basically says the reason why Britain was so terrible in the Second World War was because its economy was appalling. It was absolute rubbish. Grounded ourselves into the dust, etc., etc., etc. But it sounds to me like you think you got it pretty right.
Yeah, I mean, you can judge this one by results, I think, and Britain did win.
Well, I would agree.
Well, you know what? But that's music to our ears because so much of the way the war's viewed. So for instance, how the British fight is very much seen as they're crap compared to the Germans. But there's a result. Yeah. Maybe suggests something else.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not used to saying the Treasury got something right, particularly in the 1930s. But the Treasury seems to have managed that balancing act of rearming enough that you're not going to lose a short war, but being in a position that you are reasonably confident you can win a long war. And and I think
Duncan, we've got quite a lot. We've got Chamberlain to thank for that to a certain extent.
Well, I was just going to say, surely the credit goes to Chamberlain.
To be fair, I think Chamberlain was an appalling sort of political leader in some ways. He made many mistakes on many things, but you can't. I think it's really hard to fault his management of getting Britain to a place in 1939 where it could be confident enough to declare war on Germany. There is this confidence in sort of the Anglo-French leadership. They think they can win.
Yeah. All right then. It's a sort of all right then. We'll do this. Okay, fine. If that's how you insist on behaving, it's sort of got that element, hasn't it?
Well, that is a relief to hear.
Well, Duncan, thanks so much for this. And we didn't talk about balance of payments or interest rates or the things that start to make my head hurt too much. I mean, you've done
I feel fairly in command of my brain still, which I'm quite pleased with. Oh, that's absolutely fascinating,
so
man.
much.
Really was.
Oh, no, absolutely fascinating. And thanks everybody for listening. We've been talking to Duncan Weldon, and we hope you've enjoyed it. Cheerio.
Cheerio.
Bye.